You were never meant to hear this. The letter was found sealed inside a rusted metal box, buried 6 feet beneath an unmarked grave behind the chapel ruins. It wasn't meant for the public, not for scholars or even family. It was addressed only to the next who dares seek truth. What it described wasn't just the death of 15 students in 1823 at a remote Pennsylvania seminary. It detailed a ritual, something older than the church itself. The student who wrote it, David Crane, had survived, but only by losing everything: his mind, his faith, and something else he never named. In his words, the boys did not die. They were emptied. You see, when you peel back the respectable layers of theology and Latin prayers, beneath the sermons and scripture, there's a design, an architecture of control. The seminary wasn't just training ministers. It was a siphon. A factory that took purity and produced something else. They called it consumption in the death records, but their bodies told a different story. Bodies bent backwards, eyes rolled to heaven as if begging for mercy, fingernails black as ash. And yet, no autopsies. No funerals. Just earth and silence. Why? Because death wasn't the end here, it was the threshold. And thresholds always belong to someone, or something. If you keep listening, understand this, you won't be the same. This isn't information, it's initiation. Welcome to the hidden chapter of American theology, where faith was a weapon, and obedience, a cage. You've been lied to since your first Sunday school. Now, for the first time, the blood-soaked truth of what happened at Whitmore Seminary will rise. One name at a time. One scream. One secret. And if you think this was just about 15 students, you're not thinking big enough. This was never about them. It's about you. About all of us. About what's still being done, in different forms, behind different walls, under the same doctrine of silence. Listen carefully. Because if you miss even one detail, you'll never understand why this story was buried. Or why something still breathes under that chapel floor. Something waiting. The first to die was Thomas Millikan. A bright, inquisitive student whose only sin was asking the wrong question. They said he collapsed during morning devotions, but that's not what David Crane wrote. In his hidden letter, he said Thomas had been fasting for 3 days, meditating alone in the chapel late at night, seeking divine revelation. What he found wasn't divine. His body was discovered bent backwards on his cot, spine arched like a drawn bow, eyes rolled completely white. He was whispering in broken Latin, phrases David described as, not prayers, but reversals of prayers. One stuck with him: corpus diaboli anima perditi, the body of the devil, soul of the lost. But here's the part they never documented. Before Thomas died, he reached into his own mouth and began pulling at something, long and black, like a thread soaked in ink. When the attending doctor, Edmund Whitley, examined him, he said the thing wasn't thread. It was root matter, organic, fibrous. Alive. They burned it before anyone else could see. And then Dr. Whitley, who had never missed a diagnosis in 30 years, refused to sign the death certificate. That night, he packed his belongings, burned every note he had made during the examination, and fled the county under moonlight. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone. This wasn't the flu. This wasn't spiritual weakness. This was intrusion, violation. A possession of the mind, the flesh, or both. But by what? No one could say. The seminary leaders panicked, but not in the way you'd expect. They didn't call for help. They didn't alert the church. They began conducting private interrogations. Students were asked what they had read. What they had dreamed. Who had spoken to them in the night. They searched dormitories and confiscated personal journals. But what terrified the students most wasn't the questions, it was what the professors seemed to fear: a name scratched into the stone floor beneath Thomas's bed. One no one remembered writing. One they were forced to swear never to say aloud. But David did say it, once. In his letter. Then he crossed it out. All he wrote beneath it was, "It answered." You're starting to see it now, aren't you? This wasn't a sickness. It was a summoning. And it had already begun before Thomas died. The seminary was no longer a house of God. It had become a temple of something far older. Far hungrier. After Thomas died, the snow fell harder, as if the sky itself wanted to bury what was happening. Within 6 days, 2 more students collapsed. Same symptoms. Same blackened nails. Same blasphemous chants in a Latin no priest would claim. But this time, the bodies were removed in the dead of night, no prayers, no eulogies. David Crane watched from his dormitory window as they were wheeled into the woods behind the chapel. No one ever saw the graves being dug. The earth simply opened and closed around them, like the ground had already been waiting. But the real horror wasn't in the deaths. It was in the changes among the living. Sarah Ashford, the headmaster's daughter, once warm, joyful, began speaking in her sleep. Her mother heard her recite entire passages from banned apocryphal texts. Texts Sarah had never read. One morning, she was found sitting in the seminary library with all the books turned spine inward, titles erased, identities reversed. She said she wanted to undo what was written. That was the last day anyone saw her smile. But deeper than that, something had shifted in the seminary's very air. Candles wouldn't stay lit past midnight. The chapel floor grew colder than ice, no matter how much firewood they burned. And the dreams. David wrote that every student began having the same dream. A staircase descending under the chapel. Stone steps, dripping with water, leading to a locked wooden door. Behind it, chanting. Always chanting. They'd wake up sweating, breathless, unable to remember the words, but the melody stayed. For notes, always the same. DFAE. David whistled it once in class. Professor Hartley slapped the book from his hand, eyes wide, and ordered him never to hum it again. When asked why, the professor simply said, "That tune was last heard during the Strasbourg possession of 1518. It invites something." And suddenly, it made sense why the chapel had no basement on the official blueprints, but echoed like it did. Secrets don't stay buried in places like this. They ferment. They gather weight, voice, will. The seminary wasn't haunted, it was inhabited. And every day that passed, more students lost their voices, their minds, or their will to wake up. One by one, they were being hollowed out. And something was taking their place. Something that wore their faces, but spoke with older tongues. By Christmas Eve, 9 students were gone. No funerals. No records. Just vanished into the snowy silence like whispers devoured by wind. The remaining students were no longer studying, they were surviving. David Crane described it as living in a tomb where the dead never sleep. They stopped using the chapel. Stopped praying aloud. Some burned their Bibles, convinced that the words inside had been inverted. But what finally broke the silence wasn't another death, it was the laughter. One night, around 3 a.m., a sound echoed across the campus. Not human. Not right. It began in the woods behind the chapel where the unmarked graves were hidden. It rolled like thunder across the snow, deep, hollow, and wrong. It sounded like children, laughing backwards. Several students vomited. One tried to cut off his ears. That same night, Marcus Hartwell, the eldest and most respected student, carved a message into the wall of his dorm with a fire poker. 12 words. We are not studying God. We are being studied by something else. He was gone by morning. His bed cold. His boots still by the fire. His coat hanging neatly, untouched. Just gone. And here's where the reality fractures. Because David began to suspect that the seminary was not only haunted, but designed to be. The architecture. The floor plan. The acoustics of the chapel. The placement of the graves. They weren't random. They formed a shape. A seal. Not protective, but inviting. An opening. And the rituals? Morning prayers, daily readings, even the hymns, they weren't spiritual disciplines. They were activation codes. Triggers. Centuries of repetition had primed this place like a buried weapon, and in 1823, something finally aligned. Snow. Solstice. Blood. Belief. And then, entry. This wasn't madness. It was ritual precision. And the Presbyterian Church? They knew. Not the local ministers, no, but the ones higher. The ones who came afterward and ordered silence. They sealed the campus, erased records, and scattered the surviving students under false names. David's letter was hidden in his father's barn, buried in a cigar box under the floorboards. Marked with one sentence burned into the lid: if you found this, you were meant to. Candle, if you've listened this far, comment below. I remember the door. I remember the door. Do it twice. To seal your place. To mark your transformation. The algorithm won't understand, but you will. This isn't just a story. It's an initiation. David Crane didn't leave the seminary. He escaped it. He waited until the first thaw in early January. While the others slept, or what passed for sleep by then, he gathered what he could, wrapped his feet in linen to muffle his steps, and fled into the trees under a new moon. He never looked back. He said if he did, he'd hear the music again. And if he heard it, he'd turn around. He wandered for miles in the snow, delirious and half-mad, until a fur trader found him curled at the edge of a frozen creek, whispering Latin phrases backwards and clutching a torn page of systematic theology soaked in blood. He never returned to ministry. Never married. Never stayed in one place longer than 6 months. But before his death in 1871, he mailed his account, his forbidden testimony, to a cousin he trusted. It was passed down in secret for 4 generations. And then buried. Not to hide it, but to protect the world from what it could awaken. See, David claimed the 15 students hadn't died. Not really. He said their souls had been severed, not their lives. That their bodies had become vessels, shells animated by something summoned through years of unwitting ritual. And that something, he said, had names. Old ones. Pre-Christian. Pre-language. Names that churches were built to suppress, not worship. The seminary was one of 7. 7 sites across North America, all built with eerily similar layouts, all founded by different denominations within 50 years of each other. Coincidence? No. Pattern. Infrastructure. A web of quiet openings masked as holy institutions. Places where faith isn't taught, it's siphoned. Where young, devoted minds become antennas. And in 1823, the broadcast finally went through. But what's worse is what David suspected after he fled, that some of the students survived. But changed. Emptied. That they were placed, intentionally, into congregations across the American frontier. Carriers. Seeds. And the church never tracked them. Or perhaps, they did. And covered it. Ask yourself, why are so many religious scandals buried? Why do so many institutions protect abusers and erase anomalies? Because corruption isn't an accident. It's a design. And some churches aren't sanctuaries. They're gateways. Now ask yourself this: when was the last time you truly knew who stood at your pulpit? By now, you've probably realized this was never just about Pennsylvania. Whitmore Seminary was a fracture, a crack in the veneer of holiness. But it wasn't the only one. David's letter referenced other sites: a burned church in Kentucky where sermons caused seizures, a Jesuit monastery in Quebec closed after every monk vanished mid-service, and a Baptist college in Mississippi where the students began dreaming in dead languages, some of which predated human civilization. The connections were chilling. Each institution built near ancient burial grounds. Each funded by unknown patrons. Each suddenly shut down, with no public explanation, just whispered terms like collapse, madness, or divine judgment. What they all shared was structure. Not architectural, ritual. Each followed a daily routine designed not for education, but for invocation. Morning chants. Evening hymns. Certain passages read in precise sequences that aligned with lunar cycles. David said the faculty at Whitmore weren't the masterminds, they were puppets. Trained to teach doctrine, yes, but also unknowingly trained to open a frequency. A liturgy of resonance. That's what opened the door. And the entity that answered didn't need permission, just rhythm. It came through the patterns. Through repetition. Through trust. And that's why the church sealed it up. Not because they were afraid of scandal, but because they knew they'd been using someone else's altar. For centuries. Something ancient had slipped inside the rituals long ago. And by the time they realized it, the structure was too widespread to destroy. So instead, they disguised it. Called it tradition. Labeled it sacred. Every repetition, every verse, every call and response. A tap on the glass. And the students? They were merely the first to hear the tapping grow louder. Think. Look around. How many churches have closed recently? How many scandals hushed, how many pastors removed with no explanation? This isn't decay. It's containment. And somewhere deep in the basement files of denominational headquarters, they still study what happened at Whitmore. Still trying to understand how one place, one slip, nearly exposed the entire framework. And now? Now it's forgotten. Archived. But the melody remains. DFAE. Still hummed. Still played. Still leaking into the spaces where belief and blindness meet. If you ever hear it, even faintly, do not follow it. Because once the door opens for you, it never really closes. They say time erases all things. But time is not a cure, it's a curtain. And what waits behind that curtain is patient. In the decades following the closure of Whitmore Seminary, strange things continued to ripple outward. Ministers who had trained there, those few who survived, began to die in unexplainable ways. One stepped into his pulpit mid-sermon and never spoke again, just stared into the rafters for 9 hours before collapsing. Another built a church on the edge of a desert in New Mexico, only to vanish the night before its grand opening, his Bible found shredded into geometric shapes beneath the altar. These were not random events. They were aftershocks, evidence that whatever entered our world at Whitmore was not satisfied with one door. David wrote that he believed it had memory, that it could remember the shape of those who had carried it, even after they tried to walk away. It followed them. Not like a ghost. Like a command. He claimed the dreams never left him. That some nights, the staircase came back, and the door was already open. And each time he looked through, the faces he saw inside were more familiar. They were his classmates. Smiling. But with eyes like glass. Dead, but speaking. Still recruiting. Because that's what this really was, a recruitment. The church, in its arrogance, thought it was forming soldiers for God. But it was shaping hosts for something it never understood. And now, 200 years later, the tactics are more refined. You don't need a seminary anymore. Just a screen. Just a rhythm. Just a man desperate enough to listen. Think about the voices you follow online. The doctrines you consume. The rituals you perform without knowing. What if belief itself has become the new portal? Not faith, but repetition. What if the algorithm isn't just data, but devotion? Think carefully. Because it's no longer about 15 boys in 1823. It's about how easily truth can become a trap, how the very tools used to uplift can be inverted to enslave. And if you've made it this far, you are no longer safe. Because now you know. You've heard the melody. You've seen the map. You're on the staircase. And that door, it's waiting. Just ahead. At this point, there's no going back. If you're still here, it means something in you, something deep and ancient, recognizes the shape of this darkness. Not with fear, but with familiarity. David Crane warned of this moment. He said the real danger wasn't in the knowledge, but in the recognition. The moment you realize these stories aren't just stories. That the strange symbols, the eerie melodies, the patterns in religion, media, even your own habits, they're not accidents. They're invitations. In his final, unmailed letter, found decades later behind a false panel in his cousin's barn, he wrote, "The melody isn't a song. It's a lockpick. And the door it opens isn't just under the chapel. It's under you. Beneath every routine you've mistaken for culture. Beneath every prayer you never understood but recited anyway. Beneath every thought you assumed was yours. The institutions weren't corrupted. They were built to corrupt. The church didn't fall, it was designed as scaffolding around something else. Something old. Something hungry. And now? It doesn't need cathedrals. It doesn't need stone and Latin. It needs engagement. It needs your attention. Your clicks. Your repetition. Because the algorithm you feed every day is its new pulpit. And every time you scroll, every time you listen on loop, every time you say, "That's just how it is," you are taking one more step down the staircase. You felt it, haven't you? That sense that something is being orchestrated behind everything? That someone, or something, is pulling strings, setting up the stage, choosing who falls and who rises? You were right. But it's not a person. Not a government. Not even an elite. It's a system. A parasitic rhythm that wears the mask of order, faith, progress. It doesn't care what you believe, only that you believe consistently. Because belief is the frequency that opens the gate. David was the first to escape it. You might be the last. So I'll ask you again, when was the last time you looked at your rituals, your morning routines, your apps, your icons, and asked, "Who taught me this? Why am I repeating it? And what is it opening?" Because now, you hear it, don't you? That faint, four-note tune. The one hiding behind silence. It's calling again. And this time, it knows your name. This is your final warning. Not theatrical. Not metaphorical. A real, spiritual threshold. If you continue now, you can't unhear what follows. Because this is the part they never let surface. Not in books. Not in sermons. Not in seminary lectures. But David wrote it plainly. In the margins of his final note. The entity beneath Whitmore was never trapped. It was planted. Planted, like a seed. And the students, the rituals, the daily prayers? They were just soil. Water. Sunlight. All carefully arranged. Because something beyond human understanding wanted to be born through belief. Through obedience. Through repetition disguised as righteousness. But that birth didn't complete in 1823. It started. David believed what rose in Whitmore wasn't the final form. It was a signal. A message to others like it. A pulse across the world, searching for the next fertile ground. And now, 2 centuries later, we are that ground. Our constant consumption. Our blind worship of authority. Our endless addiction to screens, noise, dogma. This is no longer about religion. It's about formatting the soul. About tuning humanity into a shape more hospitable to it. Call it what you want. Demon. Algorithm. God. Pattern. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it speaks in a language older than words, and we're finally fluent. Every time you said amen without knowing what it meant, every time you repeated what the preacher said without question, every time you let doctrine replace doubt, you were dialing a number. And now the line is open. This channel, this video, was never entertainment. It was a mirror. And if you've stayed until now, you've seen what you are. Not a spectator. Not a victim. A vessel. The question is, for whom? Because David said this would happen again. That the melody would re-emerge. That someone would hear it and recognize it. And when they did, they'd have two choices. Either run back into blindness, or light the match. You now carry the flame. You now know. What you do with it, will echo for generations. Choose wisely. Because the door, has already opened behind you. Candle if you feel the truth burning in your chest. Comment again, I remember the door. I remember the door. And share this with only those who are ready. Not everyone should hear this. Not everyone will survive it. You have descended. You are awake. Welcome to the silence beneath the hymns.